about the Mormon faith.
Yeah, so maybe if we can just start on her questions, which centre more around the issue of homosexuality.
Sure.
So the first question is, if homosexuality was a part of God's plan, then why can't homosexuals procreate on earth and have families?
So this question, the seat of this question is all about procreation being the important fact. That is not the case. As I've just previously mentioned, any sperm can get with any egg cell, and all of a sudden you have the creation of two bodies into which a child can incarnate. And in fact, mankind currently is doing that process in a test tube or a petri dish. And of course, I don't know. Like, there's a lot that can be said about that, but the reality is that's how simple the process of creation of the two bodies is from a simple act. Mm. The idea that somehow then defines the adult who is the parent for the rest of their existence is a ludicrous notion. There are many, many people on this planet who have never had children, and there are many of those people who are heterosexual in nature that have never had children. Does that mean that they are no longer a person, or they're no longer a valid, that they don't understand things about love automatically because they don't have children? I can't agree with that. They are just as capable of understanding love and understanding truth and having a rich experience in their life, whether they have children or not. So the whole concept that procreation is God's primary purpose for marriage is also a very strange concept. If you examine the way we're made up sexually, a woman's body is capable of orgasms, in other words, capable of sexual pleasure, without any penetration at all, and therefore without any process of creating a child. So this is an indication that God's intention with the sex act wasn't to primarily be for the sake of procreation. Of course, it's a driving factor in procreation, but it wouldn't be the only factor in procreation. In fact, the sex act has been created by God for many other reasons besides procreation that are far more important, actually, than procreation to a large degree. Now, I'm not saying procreation is unimportant, because the reality is without it, we wouldn't have the continuance of a race. But it is not as important in the definition of the parent or the child as people on the planet seem to believe.
So is it significant then that homosexuals cannot conceive a child during the sex act?
Well, I don't feel it's significant in any way. We know how a child is created. We know how a body's created. The two bodies I'm talking about, both the spirit and the material body, is created through the sex act of a male and a female. However, that does not mean that the sex between two males or sex between two females is out of harmony with what God created. Mm-hmm. And it's a presumption for mankind to define it as such. Interestingly, I feel a lot of this comes from these old, very archaic notions that the family lineage is the most important thing to maintain on the planet. I can't agree with that. We are all one family, so we are all of one lineage, and we don't need to define ourselves by what family or race we came from. We don't need to even define ourselves about how our parents got together. The reality is a homosexual couple is capable of giving children love in a loving environment just as much as a heterosexual couple is capable of doing the same thing. That is the physical reality. Now, the homosexual couple is not capable of creating the child, but as I've just pointed out, creation of the child is not really a true notion. God created the child, and all we're doing is creating the bodies for the child to live in. So we are not creating the child. We are creating the bodies in which the child uses in order to experience its life. And there are many, many people on this planet who have too many children who they cannot love and cannot care for. And I'm sure very many homosexual couples who are in a monogamous relationship with each other would love to express their love for the rest of those children's lives towards those particular children if they had the opportunity. And it's very, very unfortunate that the majority of governments and religions still have these huge notions about whether procreation is the main issue. And from God's perspective, it is not. Mm-hmm. Love is the main issue, not procreation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second of Caroline's questions is, if parenthood is a gift that God gives us to help us develop in love and highlights our law of attraction, why would God inhibit homosexuals from procreative power?
Well, again, can you see in the question there is this linkage between procreation and the gift of being a parent? There is no reason why any homosexual couple on the planet couldn't be a parent. They could be given the gift of a child that somebody else hasn't wanted, or some accident has befallen the parents or something like that, and then bring up the child in complete harmony with love. So this whole concept that somehow the gift of parenthood comes from procreation is a part of the problem. Mm-hmm. The gift of parenthood does not come from procreation. It comes from a desire to love an individual child for the rest of its life until it's able to support itself. Mm-hmm. And this is what a true parenthood really is. Unfortunately, not many people on the planet believe that. They believe parenthood is more about ownership than about love given to the child, until such a point in time that the child itself defines itself through its own interactions with the world. Mm-hmm. And so I feel it's very important for people to understand the difference between procreation, which is a physical act, and parenthood, which is an act of love given towards somebody, whether they are your own child or not. So many people who have adopted children are still called the parents of those particular children, and there's no reason why a homosexual couple should be precluded from being a parent of a child. And there are many people who would be willing and who are able or not able to care for their own children, and would be totally willing to give that child to a couple who would be willing to care for it. The whole notion, though, that it has to be a couple that cares for the child is also flawed, in the sense that many times the couple is imposing its own desire to have its own ownership over the child. That's why they want their own child. The reality is we can interact with children on a daily basis, whether we have children or not, and we can learn many things through that process of giving the gift of our love to them and understanding the relationship that we have between ourselves and them. So I don't see even that as an issue either. Just because a couple decide that they wish to have no children of their own, it doesn't automatically make them a lesser member of society, or also it doesn't automatically make them unable to understand love. Mm-hmm. The reality is there's many things that they can see happening around them that would cause them to understand love quite easily, so I don't feel it causes an inability to understand love.
Sure. Mm. Okay. All right. If a homosexual union on earth is a part of God's plan, then why weren't our bodies created so that we could have sex with males or females and enjoy the same type of double orgasmic experience?
Well, again, I feel this question comes from a misunderstanding of homosexual relationships. The reality is that homosexual couples can have a double orgasmic experience and can have, a beautiful sex life with each other in a manner that is in complete harmony with the other principles of God's laws of love, mm-hmm. which include a monogamous relationship. And so, the reality is that I feel a lot of heterosexuals do not understand homosexual relationships. Now, that's partly because they have never had one themselves, and I'm not recommending they do. Obviously, if you have a heterosexual desire, you won't want to have a homosexual relationship. But what I'm recommending to them is to listen to the people who are speaking about these relationships and come to understand what kind of sexual relationship they actually do have before they make a judgment about that relationship, about whether that's going to be truly fulfilling or not. There are many women in homosexual relationships who have what Caroline is calling a double orgasmic experience. In other words, clitoral and vaginal orgasm. And if you discuss those particular things with those people, you would find that out if you discussed it. The only reason why I know that is through 2,000 years of observing couples and listening to their stories, and I know that is the case. So this judgment that we have, that many heterosexuals have towards homosexual sexual relationships is already flawed because it's already a misunderstanding of what really goes on in a homosexual relationship from a sexual perspective. I also feel that many religions have taken on these particular belief systems from ages past and have enforced these belief systems through threat of penalty of God's disapproval of the homosexual couple. The reality is God created what you would classify as homosexual souls. In other words, souls that when they split into two halves have a preference for the same body. And in other words, one half has a preference for a male body and the other half has a preference for a male body. Or one half has a preference for a female body and the other half has a preference for a female body. I personally don't agree with bisexuality because that is not what, there's no such thing as a soul that has a preference for both kinds of bodies. That usually comes through some kind of injury process, and most of the time it comes through an injury of the parents not wanting the child to be homosexual in nature and therefore wanting the child to have heterosexual and homosexual feelings, and this causes a lot of turmoil emotionally inside of the child and causes attractions that would not normally be present if they'd been allowed to develop freely without this heavy projection from their environment. So I feel with regard to all the questions surrounding homosexuality that are related to families, there is a gross distortion in the understanding of a homosexual relationship and the capacity of homosexual people to be able to give love. They have exactly the same capacity to give love as a heterosexual couple, and no more, no less. And if they develop their relationship with God, they have a higher capacity to give love than if they don't. Just the same as a heterosexual couple. There is no difference. Some of my closest friends in the first century have been homosexuals, and I've understood their underlying feelings, and understood that was the way that they have actually been created as a part of their personal nature. Just because they cannot personally engage in procreation without breaking the bond of their sexual preference in a natural way. I'll let you have a cough. Sorry. Get it out, babe.
It's always worse when you try and stop it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So just because they, have a sexual preference that would preclude them from having a child, it doesn't mean that they cannot have children. It means that they cannot create the child's bodies. Have a good cough.
Just to recap, because we had a break.
We had a break. Mary had a cough.
Yeah.
Bit of spirit interaction.
You were just sort of summarising your answer to the third question, which was, if a homosexual union on earth is part of God's plan, then why weren't our bodies created so that we could have sex with males and females and enjoy the same type of double orgasmic experience?
Yes, and as I answered in that answer, it is possible to have sex and enjoy the same experience with the same gender. So, the reality is that we need to understand that, as a human race, we need to understand it. I feel because there is so much anger and rejection of homosexuality on the planet, and this anger and rejection has been present in human history for a long period of time now, and because of this anger and rejection, not many heterosexual people actually understand a homosexual relationship. It's obvious that many homosexuals do understand what's involved in a heterosexual relationship, but very, very few heterosexual couples actually understand what's involved in a homosexual relationship. And if they did understand, they would have a lot more compassion and understanding to the actual couples involved. In addition, they wouldn't ask silly questions. And I do believe that many of the questions that heterosexual couples ask of homosexuals with regard to their sexual relationship are quite strange questions, given that you can easily think about it and find out the answer. But if not, sure, ask the question, but understand that a lot of these questions are not coming from an openness to understanding, but rather coming from a very closed perspective about what's involved in a homosexual union.
Okay, well, finally,
So I suppose we need to address the issue with relating to religion generally, because there is this issue where homosexuality is generally condemned by most of the world's major religions. If you look at all of the Christian faith, most of the Christian faith condemns a homosexual union. If you look at faiths like Buddhism, generally it condemns a homosexual union for very similar reasons. And the Muslim faith generally does the same as well. So if you look at most of the major faiths on the planet, there are some big issues that the religious faiths actually are facing right at this moment in time in terms of acceptance of a fairly large number of people on the planet. And I find it quite sad that these religions keep perpetrating even violence towards these particular couples, when the reality is they could understand them and ask a lot of questions that would cause them to understand God and the reason why God has actually created people with this kind of tendency towards each other, which is a natural tendency for their particular soul to experience. And if they understood the underlying principles and they understood the couples, they would understand too that their own belief systems have been created by mankind, not by God. And this is a very important thing to understand. If you look at many of the world's religions, they all say there is some kind of punishment due to a homosexual couple or a homosexual individual. And this is not the truth at all. In fact, in the spirit world, there are many, many homosexual couples who enjoy beautiful relationships with each other, with their soulmate, and who are also at one with God in their nature. And so it's very, very important for homosexual couples themselves to understand that there's nothing unnatural about it whatsoever. And it's very important for heterosexual couples and religions and politics to all understand that there is nothing unnatural about it whatsoever. What is unnatural is having relationships with lots and lots and lots of different people. That is unnatural. That is something God didn't intend for people to experience without there being some pain associated with those kind of experiences. Because there are some penalties for breaking the law of love whenever we break it. And heterosexual couples are just as capable of having unnatural relations with other heterosexual people as homosexual couples are. And we are also just as capable of what I would classify to be sexual immorality. So our definition of what is moral is quite often quite hypocritical. So the very same people, generally historically, who created this abnormal fear against a homosexual union, have also been the very same people that perpetrated the beliefs of polygamy and other such things. So I find that very interesting. How the same, a lot of times, exactly the same underlying emotional issues drive both belief systems, polygamy and opposition towards homosexuality.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, if you look at polygamy, one of the primary reasons for the creation of polygamy was that one man gets to enjoy many women, which is actually an immoral sexual thing from God's perspective. Secondly, that this one man has the ability, through his relationship with many women, to have many children, tens or even potentially hundreds of children, depending on how much of a polygamist he is, which is all about the extension of your genetic code into the next generation, which is the exact injury that I was talking about, this feeling of ownership of children. So the exact same thing that causes that same male to be against homosexuality is actually causing him to support polygamy.
So I know that you spoke about that in one of the earlier interviews with Caroline about this idea of having lots of children in order to continue a faith on earth. Do you feel that is why, this is my question now, do you feel that is why a lot of faiths are opposed to homosexuality, because they see it as something, a union that does not create children?
Well, I feel that is one of their motives, yes. Certainly one of their motives. If you look at the growth of religious faith on the planet, a lot of the way that religious faith is enforced is through the family concept. A family who breaks the religious faith, so a family member who breaks the religious faith and chooses another, is also generally excommunicated, not only from their religion, but also from the family. In other words, the family heaps huge amounts of pressure upon that particular person to have them conform back into the religious faith. So obviously there is a huge amount of pressure upon people on this planet to stay in the same faith as their parents, to never change. And having children from a religious perspective causes people to believe that they will have many children to support the faith. And this is not God's intention or a good reason to have a child. A good reason to have a child is to love it and allow it its own free will of expression. And to train it, that there are laws and these laws can be broken. And the laws are not to do with faith, but rather to do with love. They're all surrounding the issues of love, not faith. Mm-hmm. So just because another person chooses, someone in the family chooses a different faith, they should not automatically not be loved. They should still be loved. Yes. And in fact, a truly loving family wouldn't be so addicted to a person having the same faith as themselves. And a lot of that is all about the parent believing that they know best and trying to enforce what they feel they know best about onto the child. Mm-hmm. And that is a very unloving act. And it also doesn't allow the whole of human society to grow very rapidly. Because naturally, if each successive generation finds out more about the world and science and life generally, then each successive generation is going to know more than the previous one. You could say that we know right now far more than our forefathers about technology. Right? We understand how a lot of things work that they did not understand. And this is a natural process. It's interesting, we allow it in science, but we do not allow it in religious faith. We do not allow it in political ideology generally. These are areas that the family have strict control over and do not allow growth. Mm. And this needs to change. Mm-hmm. Mm.
Okay, finally from Caroline, did you discuss homosexuality when you taught in the first century?
Yes. In the first century I did mention homosexuality. Of course, there were huge confrontations with different people who were even people who followed us in terms of the teachings in the first century. And as a result of that, many of the teachings that I gave about homosexuality never made it into the Bible, ever. Mm-hmm. And that was because there was a huge amount of societal resistance towards the concepts of loving any person in the culture rather than just selectively choosing based upon your own fears. Mm. And they also did not understand truly the concept of soulmates. They did not understand that there's some souls that split and have the affinity towards the same body, and other souls split and have the affinity towards different bodies. Now, the way that God created bodies is around 80 to 90% of souls that split do have an affinity to the opposite body. So in other words, one half an affinity to a male body, the other half an affinity to a female. And God created that, I believe, so that the human race could continue to procreate naturally and enjoy sexual union and procreation. But he didn't do it to then justify the unloving treatment of the other 20% of people. Mm-hmm. Right.
Just from my own reflection, it would, because of what we understand from the vastness of what you've taught about homosexuality now, which obviously we're not able to summarise completely here, but there would be different gifts amongst people who have a dominantly masculine soul or a dominantly feminine soul. Mm-hmm. But because the expression of masculinity and femininity on the planet is so often distorted, we don't fully receive those gifts either. And right. I suppose because so many homosexual people are treated very harshly and rejected. A lot of homosexual people, because of the treatment that they have been under for many millennia, they have a deep level of anger and rage towards heterosexual society, which they express through ridicule, making up things, even drag and other things like that are often expressions of just confronting or being in the face of people in the heterosexual community just to confront the problem. Many of them, if they had grown up in an accepting environment, they wouldn't feel this deep need to rebel against the society because the society would have already accepted them. And the deep forms of rebellion that are present in almost all forms of human society often come from this deep underlying bigotry that is in human society towards different things. And, you look at a mainstream Christian society, it's got bigotry towards any other religion. A mainstream Muslim society often has a similar bigotry. And this is a problem, when all of the religions learn to love and all of the people on the planet decide to love, even if, even the Christians love the atheist and the atheist loves the Christian, and
and no one's bigoted towards each other and their belief systems, then we'll have a very harmonious society on the planet. But not until then. And if all of us accepted all forms of things from a love perspective, I'm not saying we have to accept untruth, but we need to treat people lovingly. And we don't have to accept being treated badly either, but we need to treat people lovingly and be firm for love. And when we do that, we actually become more accepting of everybody and more allowing of everybody's personal choices and decisions. And when we do that, they feel less need to rebel against against what we enforce. And this is the main problem with society as well. Even a lot of our laws here in Australia, a lot of our laws have only recently, when I say recently, in the last 30 years, a lot of our laws have changed to have been more accepting towards homosexuality, but we still do not have a law in Australia that allows the marriage of homosexual. And I'm not saying in Australia, because there are some states in Australia that do, but I mean as a whole of Australia, there are still states who will not accept a homosexual union as a marriage. And this is ludicrous, really. But when you think about it, it was only 100 years ago that women couldn't vote either, and women were treated like they weren't people either. And you know, this is an indication of the changes that we need to make. We have come a certain distance over the last 100 years in terms of equality, but we've still got a long way to go to improve it.
And I think we heard recently the statistic or the fact about just the legalisation of homosexuality has only occurred in this state that we're in today, in New South Wales, in the last 35 years.
That's right. Yeah, I think it was in the early 1980s or something. Yeah. So if you think about that, there's been thousands of years of homosexual couples on the planet, and yet we've only just legalised it. How slow are we, really? And if you look at religion is one of the reasons why we're slow, because there is this belief system in religions generally that homosexuality is somehow, that God hates it. In fact, there's some statements in the Bible that would tend to indicate that. God doesn't hate anything, for a start. God is not wrathful, not angry, not punishing, or any of those things. God doesn't have a vendetta. God is not resentful. These concepts of a wrathful God cause religions to enforce concepts upon people that are obviously out of harmony with love. And this has especially been the case with homosexual people. And this is very, very damaging to them, but it's also damaging to the rest of society, because we do not get to explore the richness of our society while we condemn one type of persons in our society. Yeah. And they are not unusual. They are naturally created. And this is what I can't stress enough. God created them. They are created this way as a way of an expression, a part of an expression of God's personality, actually. And we need to have more contact and more understanding before we'll understand God more. Yeah. That's the reality.
Okay.
So in terms of the Mormon religion or Mormon faith, I don't see them as any different to any other Christian faith who condemns homosexuality, for very, very similar reasons. And I don't see them any different as many of the other faiths, such as Buddhism and the Muslim faith, Islam, who also have a tendency to condemn homosexuality for very, very similar reasons. They are all very similar in that they all condemn it for the reasons mentioned, and it's time that we saw this in a completely different light than we're currently seeing it.
Okay. All right, in part 2 of the Mormon interview, you discussed the temple and how in reality priesthood ordinances have no bearing upon progression towards God in the spirit world.